Have you ever cleaned your house and noticed that somehow your mind felt clearer too? Nothing magical happened. You changed something in your environment, but somehow something inside of you seemed to change with it. So, what if that's pointing towards a much older idea? As above, so below. As within, so without. Today we're exploring the second Hermetic Principle, the Principle of Correspondence. What is correspondence? The Kabbalion summarized the principle of correspondence with the phrase, as above, so below, as below, so above. Now you probably heard some version of that before. The Hermetic teaching uses correspondence to describe a relationship or harmony between different levels of existence: the physical plane, the mental plane, and the spiritual plane. But I don't want you to get lost in ancient terminology. Here's the practical idea that I want you to take away. Patterns repeat. Sometimes the small can help us understand the large, and sometimes what's happening around us can help us recognize that something's happening within us. Think of a mirror. A mirror doesn't create what's standing in front of it, it reveals it. And I think that's an important distinction. And I'm not saying everything happening in your outer world was caused by something happening inside of you, but sometimes our outer circumstances can reveal patterns that we haven't recognized within ourselves. Think about it. Your calendar reveals your priorities, your bank statement reveals your spending patterns, your home reveals your habits, your relationships can reveal communication patterns, and so on and so forth. Now, correspondence becomes practical when we look at it this way. In Lesson 1, we studied the first Hermetic principle, mentalism. Mentalism asks us, what's happening within me? What am I thinking? What am I believing? What story am I repeatedly telling myself? Correspondence takes us one step further. Now we ask, where else is this pattern showing up? That's where the principle became very personable for me. Now I'm going to be a little vulnerable here. When I look back over my life, there were times when I found myself in relationships where I didn't feel valued, I didn't feel supported, I didn't always feel respected, and sometimes I accepted behavior that, looking back today, I realized I shouldn't have accepted. Now, let me make something clear. I'm not saying I caused another person's behavior. Every individual is responsible for how they choose to treat other people. But eventually I had to stop looking only at the other person and ask myself a much harder question. Why was I willing to accept it? That question changed something for me, because when I started looking honestly at myself, I began recognizing a pattern. It wasn't only settling in relationships, I was settling in other areas of my life too. There were things that I knew that I wanted to accomplish, and I started noticing that pattern everywhere. I saw it in procrastination. I spent years reading, studying, preparing, learning. That's right, I said years, but sometimes not taking enough action. I could see versions of that pattern in business. I could see it in my finances. I could see it in expectations I have for myself, different circumstances. But there seemed to be a similar pattern underneath them. And that's when correspondence began making sense to me. Not as fortune telling, not as something bad happened to me, therefore I created it. And I know you've heard that too before. No, not that. But for me, it became pattern recognition. Where else is this showing up? What am I tolerating? What choices am I repeatedly making? What do I believe about myself and why? Eventually, I had this epiphany, this realization, if you will. I began recognizing something deeper. I needed to develop a stronger sense of my own value. Again, I wasn't responsible for how someone else chose to treat me, but I became responsible for deciding what I was willing to continue accepting. That's a big difference. And as I began changing the way I saw myself, I began changing other things too. What I tolerated, the boundaries I established, choices I made, actions I took, and gradually I began seeing changes in other areas of my life. That's how I'm beginning to understand the principle of correspondence. Recognize the pattern and you gain an opportunity to interrupt it. Now, modern psychology doesn't call this the Hermetic Principle of Correspondence, and I'm not suggesting that psychology proves Hermetic philosophy, but psychology does recognize that our thoughts, beliefs, emotions, behaviors, they interact with one another. Change one part of the pattern, and sometimes other parts begin to change too. That's why becoming conscious of your patterns is so powerful. So, here's a practical application that I want you to do. a pattern audit, if you will. Take out your phone, your notebook, your journal. Pick one area of your life where you're not satisfied with the results. Maybe it's your money. Maybe it's your relationships. Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's your health. And it could be a myriad of other areas. And then ask yourself, what else or where else does this pattern show up? Maybe the pattern is, I'm always waiting until I'm ready. Okay. Now, does that show up in your business? Does that show up in your relationships, your finances? So maybe you're not dealing with 5 or 4 completely different problems. Maybe you're seeing one recurring pattern appearing 5 different ways. So hey, if you tackle that one pattern, you can solve 5 different problems all at the same time. And that's powerful. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What pattern keeps showing up in my life, and what might it be trying to teach me? Don't beat yourself up. Don't condemn yourself, blame yourself. Just observe. There's a difference. Be good to yourself. My mom used to always tell me, be good to yourself, son. So I'm saying the same thing to you. So this week, for the next 7 days, notice one recurring pattern. Don't judge it. Don't immediately try to fix it. Just track it. Where does it appear? Who are you around? What were you thinking? How did you respond? What did you do next? And most importantly, where else does this same pattern appear? And at the end of the week, look for the correspondence. So your research source actually emphasizes this as self-observation, looking at the recurring patterns, the daily rituals, the inner language, and the repetitions, rather than treating your experiences as isolated events. So here's the principle. When you recognize a pattern, you gain the power to interrupt it. Let that sink in. And I'm going to say it again. When you recognize the pattern, you gain the power to interrupt it. So you can't constantly change a pattern that you don't recognize. Understand that in closing here, the principle of correspondence says, as above, so below, as within, so without. But don't just memorize the words. Look for the pattern. Look for your habits. Look at your relationships. Look at your environment. Look at your choices. And most importantly, look at the conversation you're having with yourself. Because sometimes what's happening around you can help you recognize something that's happening within you. And when you recognize a pattern, you gain the power to interrupt it. That's where the transformation can begin. And perhaps, once again, the most important place to look is within. And as I always say, the only way out is in. Peace, one love, and control your destiny.